Hello, my name is Julian Francis De La Fuente, and I'm going to start on my project for Theo, Module 2 Performance Tasks. I will start this recording with the movie that I've watched before, which is very interesting, The Mission. It was a 1980s film about the experiences of the Jesuits. So, during the colonial period, the Catholics were the ones always spreading the word of God all over the world, like the Jesuit missionaries. One time in this movie, the Jesuits tried converting a Guarani tribe. So there's this native tribe in Brazil, around where is now Paraguay and Uruguay, and they wanted to convert them to Christianity. At first, they were not welcome at all, the priests, and they were not into the religion of Christianity. And they even sacrificed this priest at the start with a cross, crucified him into a cross. Afterwards, there's this priest who tried getting close with them, and he succeeded for a while. So the Jesuit mission was a success. But then, because of politics, things could change. In this movie, we see the fighting between, or the conflicts between two of the most powerful colonial empires in the Americas. The Spaniards, which they owned the colonies of what is now Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, and the Portuguese, which used to own what is now Brazil. The Spaniards and the Portuguese, they had a treaty of exchanging lands. So the Spaniards exchanged the land where the Jesuit mission is now in, which was protected by the Spaniards, to the Portuguese. They ceded it to Brazil. So what's the main problem in the movie? The main theme is about slavery. So the Portuguese, the Spaniards, even though they were Christians, they were not below slavery. Slavery was very important for the sugar plantations in the Americas. So they needed workers and laborers to work off those fields, to sell tobacco, and it was very important to the economy. So the Jesuits, they were protecting that tribe. And the Jesuits, they were also protected by the Spanish government. And when the Spanish ceded it by treaty to the Portuguese were very willing to enslave the natives to the plantations. And they were not happy about the Jesuit missions because it was impeding their slaving missions in the area. So in the end of the movie, there was a very heroic sacrifice by the priests and the natives against the joint colonial forces of the Spaniards and the Portuguese, the Jesuit priests, because they knew that these people, they were also people. Even though they weren't white, they weren't European, they knew that they were also people, and they knew they were above slavery. They knew that they were above profit, and they knew that Jesus loves everyone, and they knew that Jesus spreads his word throughout all peoples, not just white people, not just the Jews. But then they failed. And then this might be one of the reasons why the Jesuits got suppressed, because it annoyed the monarchies of what is now Spain, which is related to the monarchies of what is now France and Austria, and especially Portugal. Portugal was one of the first countries to ban the Jesuits or suppress the Jesuits for decades. They started putting their missions in what is now United Kingdom. There they were Protestant countries. Prussia, also another Lutheran country. And Prussia is now Germany right now. And Russia, which was Orthodox. They were banned from all the Catholic countries because the Jesuits were interfering with the imperialism or the colonial matters of the state. So there was a struggle. This reflection, I want to talk about two things that were shown in the movie that are very much relevant today, and that would be racism and imperialism. So racism probably has its roots in the slavery of Africans, but slavery also has darker roots. It wasn't really racist before. It goes all over the world before. It was worldwide. From the Middle East to the Americas, there was slavery. But let's focus on the racism. So, when the Spanish and the Portuguese and multiple European nations discovered the New World, the Africans and the Asians, a pope issued a bull against slavery called Sublimis Deus by Pope Paul III in 1537. So he wrote about how the Indians, peoples of the Americas, which is now North and South America, the native peoples there, he said that they have free will and they were very much human. So the church here condemned slavery of the natives in America. But obviously that didn't stop the European powers. Slavery was just very good for the economy. It's like very good for the system. This was just like 500 years ago. The church already condemned slavery. So other popes condemned slavery like Benedict the 14th, Urban the 8th, and Pope Gregory the 14th. They condemned the slave trade. And Pope Gregory the 16th issued a bull called In Supremo. So it was against the slave trade. So many countries in the world during the 19th century already banned slavery. Like one of the most powerful countries during the Victorian era was Britain, United Kingdom. They banned slavery. And most of Europe followed suit. But many New World nations, like the newly freed United States and Brazil, which got its independence from Portugal after the Napoleonic Wars, they were still doing slavery. So from the beginning, the church was already against slavery, but then the church had less power than the state. The states or the kingdoms of Spain, the kingdoms of Britain and France, the church had less power. But then it was clear that the church was already against slavery. So the church recognized that non-Christians had personhood and they can be with Christ. How does this affect the modern day right now? The slavery and the oppression. So let's see. In the United States, even after the Civil Rights Act was implemented, even after the Civil War, there was still racial discrimination and segregation. We see this in the ways communities were formed. So the houses were segregated and the blacks were intentionally kept in the urban poor areas of the city. Even though it wasn't institutionalized anymore, it was already socialized that the black people should be here and the white people should be here. So it was not by the government anymore, it was by the companies. It was the people who didn't really like black people. It was racism still affects us today. Even in the police, you see them brutalizing or abusing their power, especially towards people of color. And for instance, George Floyd, it was really brutal. So it seems like the police care less about the black people's lives than white people's lives. So it's still a sad reality today. We see that the blacks still have a lower income and they still have a lower place in society. Even though the institutional part was gone, there's still subtle ways to prevent black people from reaching places of power or reaching a voice. So that's why in the States they're protesting about these issues right now. In the Philippines today, racism is not much of an issue. Maybe during the colonial era with the Spaniards and the Americans. But the second point of the movie is still pretty much present today. And that is the effects of imperialism. So for centuries, the Europeans have been exploring the world. And then their might and the wealth of European countries today came not only from their technology nor their weapons, but through their conquests. We see the fast conquest of the Spaniards, the Iberians, the Portuguese in the Americas. We see how the Dutch colonized the East Indies, which is now Indonesia and Malaysia. And in the late 17th century or the early 18th century, we see the British take over India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So racism is still there, but then it was more to the effect of imperialism, and it pretty much affects us right now. So we see the difference between the colonizers and the colonized. We see the wealth of what is now France. France was a very, very powerful colonial power. And the wealth of France right now, compared to its former colonies, let's say Algeria, Mali, Niger, we see France is still very industrialized, it's rich. We see Britain. Britain was one of the well-known colonial powers. They ruled a quarter of the world. And we see Britain is very, very wealthy compared to the parts it colonized. And we saw also the difference between, let's say, Australia. Australia is a settlement colony. There were barely any natives there, so it was mainly white. We see the United States mainly white compared to its African colonies. Let's say Egypt, Zimbabwe, India, Pakistan, Malaysia. We see the wealth difference. We see the racism there. So imperialism, colonialism, it was mainly the exploitation of the world, the Asians and the Africans and the Native Americans. We see how the Europeans got much power or got much resources from the exploitation of the world. The Philippines got colonized by two European powers, and if you compare Spain and Philippines, the difference in their development is massive. So we see this through the coercion theory, like the power of European powers, their weapons and their technology, to take the resources from the third world to the first world countries. During World War II or World War I, you can count in your fingers how many independent non-European countries there are. So there was China, Japan, Thailand, Ethiopia. So you can barely count any Asian or African countries that were independent during that time. And it is said, like especially after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire was one of the largest Muslim countries. So it is said after World War I, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, that there were no independent Islamic states in the world. So even Turkey was under control of the forces of France, Britain, and the States. So they were partitioning the Ottoman Empire. So we see the partition of what is now Syria. And we see how these borders today is very much related to the conflicts of what is now in the Middle East. For example, there was nationalism throughout the Middle East. There was an Arabian nationalism. And then that was ignored by the colonial powers. So, for instance, the French, they took over Syria. The British took over Iraq. Egypt was already taken over by the British before the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And we see how these conflicts correlate with the borders that the Europeans made. So we see the conflicts in the Middle East, and then it correlates to the imperialism of the British. And then Africa has a lot of pretty straight borders, and it is said that those borders that the Europeans made don't correspond to the culture of the peoples there. So maybe tribes got separated by two colonial powers. Like what happened in the mission, you see the Portuguese and the Spanish separating tribes. So the European powers didn't care about the cultures or like the territories of these people. They were just splitting up the territories and resources for themselves. So the history of the last 2 centuries was the history of European exploitation of the world, and it still affects many countries today, especially in Africa and in Asia. For instance, what was the goal of the Europeans in conquering the world? So many Europeans see themselves as the more civilized types. They were out there to civilize the peoples of the world, especially when they colonized Africa during the 1890s through the Treaty of Berlin. They wanted to spread the Western ideals of Christianity and to the native peoples of Africa. But of course, there was a good thing for the Europeans too. They wanted the resources of Africa. Africa is a very rich continent. In what is now Zimbabwe, Botswana, there's a lot of diamonds. Egypt was a very important place because that's where the French and the British built this West Canal to connect Europe to the rest of Asia without going through the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. the Europeans might say they were doing this to civilize the peoples. They were also extracting the resources. And let's say in India, so the British had a belief that the Indians couldn't rule themselves. So that's why we need to teach them how to rule themselves. And if you look at the history of India, there were multiple empires that ruled India. Let's say there's the Mughal Empire. There were very good empires. The Marathi Empire, the Mauryans. So the British still had that belief before that they couldn't rule themselves. And the British, sometimes they abandoned the Indians too. There were famines in India and they didn't do anything about it. And it's quite ironic right now because, like, especially with the wars in Africa, the poverty in Africa and the Middle East, and the threats of terrorism, there are many immigrants coming from those developing countries to the more developed countries of Europe. And it's quite ironic because the Europeans, they colonized all these countries without any permission. But now, they don't want these immigrants. It's pretty sad and very ironic because the Europeans took all the resources from these countries, and I would go as far to say that the colonies are the ones that made Europe rich. Even the Philippines, we see concepts like the white man's burden, that these brown people, the Filipinos, they couldn't rule themselves, so they need us, the Americans, to rule for them. So this was pretty much racism, and that's how imperialism and colonialism and slavery, racism, they all connect. We also see posters from Australia because Australia is very far away from Europe, and the Australians see themselves surrounded by brown people, the Indians, the Indonesians, the Chinese, and they didn't like that much, and they were white. So imperialism and the context of racism are very much connected, even if it's not even about slavery. We also see this with religion. The countries that were colonized, especially in Asia, when the Ottoman Empire was dissected by France and Britain, there was a reawakening of Arab nationalism because many countries in the Middle East, they speak Arabic and they had a common history of being under Arabic speaking states. Goes back to the 9th century or the 7th century when they were ruled under various caliphates. There was Arab nationalism. We also see Islamic ideals to contrast themselves with the Western ideals of Christianity. We also see imperialism in what is now Iran. The British controlled the oil there, so they had a revolution, the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And there was also a violent partition of what is now India and Pakistan. For centuries before the British came, there were already disputes and conflicts between the Hindus and the Muslims. It was very historical because the Muslims under various sultanates like the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, they were Muslims and the Hindus didn't get much representation. So the British decided to split up their colony of India, British Raj, into two. The one that's now majority Muslim is Pakistan and Bangladesh, while the majority Hindu countries is now India. So it's all connected. Racism and slavery are both bad, not just because they deny someone's right, but because they deny a person's humanity. You deny their connection to God and you treat them like objects. Jesus was from the Middle East, and obviously if Jesus was alive right now, he would look like someone from the Middle East. Probably someone that looks Egyptian, probably that looks Syrian, probably that looks Israeli, probably looks like an Arab. He doesn't look like someone with blonde hair, white skin. He looks like a normal person from the Middle East. So it's an interesting thought. So nowadays, the church leaders such as Pope Francis have tried to fix the negative relations of the church with the tribes. So we have the issue with the Pachamama. So when he was asked, he said, "Who am I to judge?" And Pope Francis has responded to the issues of immigration. So he reminded Christians all over the world to take open arms, to take migrants with open arms. Because obviously, they are people too. In the Philippines, we also have issues with the Lumads. So the Lumads are the indigenous peoples in Mindanao. So they're getting persecuted usually. Not really persecuted, but their lands are getting taken away. So maybe we can do something about that. And the church has become more accepting and more ecumenical. They become more accepting of Islam. And Pope John Paul II apologized to the crimes committed by the Crusaders in the Middle East during the Crusades. So it's a changing world. But what would God, for me, what would I think God would do about racism? Obviously, God created us all. And even whatever color we have, He would still see us as human, capable of love and dignity. No matter how light your skin is or how dark your hair is, we are all beings capable of love and respect. No matter what language they speak, whether it be Swahili or Arabic, they're still human. We can't just disregard the issue of racism because racism still exists today, especially in countries with history like Brazil and the United States. And we can't just disregard that. We can't just forget that. And that's one thing about learning history is that we need to remember. We need to remember all things that happened, from the Holocaust to the colonization of America and Africa. We should never forget. So together, maybe God can guide us towards a better future where we can understand people of different cultures, race, or religion. And really, I expected less of the church, in all honesty. But then it turns out, even 500 years ago, the church already made encyclicals and papal bulls regarding issues of slavery and racism. But then the church wasn't able to do much, but that's also on their part to stop it. But then the church actually did something. They understood the value of human beings, not just Europeans or not just Christians. They understood the value of human beings from all over the world. And especially the Jesuits, they tried understanding the cultures of peoples all over the world, from Mughal emperors to Chinese emperors to Japanese kings. They tried to understand. Maybe that's the thing I like about Jesuits. They try to explore and they try to understand other cultures. They know how to spread faith without much violence. Once again, I'm Julian De La Fuente, and I think this will be the end of my Theology Module 2 reflection.